I'm John Batchelor. Mary Kissel, my colleague, co-host with me. She is the host of Opinion Journal each day at 1 p.m. East Coast time. You can see it right now. Mary's had two conversations today in two pieces with Fred Kagan of AEI, who is a very careful commentator on American foreign policy. And right now, Mary is asking him about Iraq. It's the presenting news today, the president's announcements of 300 advisors, and then fog of war talk about what will the advisors do, given that we spent $15 trillion to develop an Iraqi army and police, 6 divisions of which ran away when 3,000 guys in masks showed up. So I can't say that the American advice has come to positives. So Mary's questions today were weighty foreign policy, something Mary is fresh at because she comes to it and says, well, what are we going to do, Fred? And Fred had some important advice because he said, this is what we should do, this is what they're going to do.
Two very different things,
yes,
John.
Very different things. And I took down notes, Mary, but he focused on the fact that what we need to do is put a whole lot of weight into the Sunni part of the country. A whole lot of weight. And I think he used the term thousands of advisors. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, he did. He used the term thousands. And I think the basic point is that not every Sunni is an extremist, and there are tribal leaders and other Iraqis who aren't represented by ISIS and whom allied with the U.S.-led side in the last conflict and would probably do so again if we showed some support. Now, John, Fred knows of whence he speaks because Fred was the brains behind the Iraqi surge. So this isn't just some analyst or think tanker or some historian who's sitting in his ivory tower. This is a guy who's been through Iraq, who advised Petraeus, and for whom George W. Bush took a very big bet on his idea. And as it turned out, Fred was right. So when he said thousands of advisors, and then I heard the president come out and say 300, right. You know immediately that the president isn't serious.
Thousands of advisors in the Sunni part of the country. Iraq, 3 parts. All Gaul is divided into 3 parts. We do that with Iraq too. Okay, we've got the Kurds in the north. That's Kurdistan, the state that was denied sovereignty at the Versailles Treaty. Mention it to Clemenceau when you next see him. So when we have the Shia part of the country in the south, and this is where Maliki sits with a sectarian government, very keen to cooperate with Tehran. And we have the Sunni part that's very difficult to say where it begins and where it ends. That's what Fred Kagan is talking about.
Right. And it was interesting that Fred didn't disagree with President Obama that Maliki probably should go. He nodded to that and said he's not a helpful figure and that he hoped that there were other more reasonable people who could take his place and actually facilitate some sort of reconciliation. So then I said to him, well, do we have any leverage over Maliki now? And he said, well, not when you're calling for him to go and not when you haven't been there for years. So I think he described our options as being really bad or even worse.
No, bad, much worse, impossible. And then you asked him, what would you do? And we've started with that. These thousands of advisors. Now, I hesitated, Mary, when I heard thousands of advisors because that takes me back to my youth. Thousands of advisors is where it began with Vietnam, to give advice to the South Vietnamese, this is the two government, to give advice to stand up to the insurgency at the time called the Viet Cong. You didn't have a chance because you're in a very quick period
very short
to focus this. But what I learned from Fred Kagan today is that this is part of the conversation now, part of how many and where to use them. The president today said 300, but it felt like the president was offering us a little bit, and we didn't get the whole story.
I think what the president is offering is containment, and he doesn't want to win. And where Fred ends up, because I said to him, Fred, is the president going to do anything that you suggest? Because it sounds like pretty reasonable advice. Well, that's what I was implying. I didn't say that, but it did sound like pretty reasonable, well-informed advice. And he said, well, no. So then the natural question is, well, then what's going to happen? And Fred's fear is that you're going to have this terror group there contained, Iran with this permanent influence over a large swath of the country. And when I asked him, Fred, do you trust Iran? Should we work with Iran?
This is the laugh line of the moment.
Oh,
yes.
he just burst out into this huge laugh.
I had to watch the video twice at that point, Mary, because I thought you told him a joke that I missed.
Yeah, I didn't think it was a joke.
Right,
I was sincerely asking him, do you think we can trust Iran?
As
and he
I
just
recall,
erupted.
Fred's remark was, if you add Iran to this, they will make it worse. Guaranteed.
Right.
That's what you can trust them to make it worse.
Guaranteed.
Detail here, too, because what Fred Kagan is describing is an ongoing civil war. We're not at the edge of civil war.
Right.
Iraq is in civil war.
Right.
So the future is grim.
Very grim.
And there was no exit. This tunnel did not have an exit once we begin.
I don't think he said that the war wasn't winnable.
No, we didn't come to that. Civil war is extant.
Yes, unless we took actions to the extent that he suggests, which of course isn't going to happen under this president.
And he talked about Iran putting combat troops in, not just advisors. He talked about boots there permanently, influencing Maliki's government. He also said that there's not a quick alternative to Maliki because we'll get even more sectarian
Well, look,
statements.
Iran is a state sponsor of terror.
Right.
And killed a lot of U.S. troops in Iraq when we were there under Bush. So the idea that the United States would talk to Iran or partner with Iran, a state sponsor of terror, to fight another terrorist group is inane.
Mary's conversation today, Fred Kagan, you can see it online, but this begins the conversation about advisors. How much, what follows, what power do they have, the Maliki government. Gosh, it feels like I'm back in 1961. Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal and the host of Opinion Journal. I'm John Batchelor.